No more waiting. She arrived with $3,800 in a dream. He left her with 11 cents and a lie. She didn't cry. That was the thing nobody understood. Not Silas Greer, who watched her from the doorway every morning. Not the stagecoach driver who'd last seen her climb down with her chin high and her hands steady. Not even the woman who brought her watery soup each evening without meeting her eyes. Margaret Calloway did not cry. She counted. 11 cents, one dime, one penny. That was everything left of the woman she used to be, the woman who had packed 4 years of careful saving into a leather satchel, who had folded each letter from Daniel Rourke like it was scripture and kept them tied with a green ribbon in the bottom of her trunk, who had stood on the Philadelphia train platform on a Tuesday morning in October and thought, "This is the bravest thing I have ever done." She had been right. It was also the most costly. 3 days. She'd been sitting on this bench for 3 days, watching the horizon swallow the same empty road, waiting for a man who was never going to come. The Montana wind had no patience for grief. It came down from the mountains with a cruelty that felt almost personal, cold fingers finding every gap in her wool shawl, every crack in the wooden boards beneath her feet, every hollow place inside her chest that Daniel's letters had once filled. Tomorrow, Silas Greer would put her out. He had said it plainly without apology. The way men in this territory said all difficult things is fact, not cruelty. "You owe me $4, Miss Calloway. Stage comes through at dawn. I need the room." $4. She had 11 cents. What you are about to hear is not a story about a woman who was saved. It is a story about a woman who stopped waiting and what she built from the wreckage of everything she thought she knew about trust, love, and the particular loneliness of a life lived too carefully for too long. If you want to know how Margaret Calloway went from 11 cents on a broken bench to the woman who locked the door on the man who destroyed her, stay with me until the very end. And before we begin, drop a comment below and tell me what country are you watching from right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button so more people can find it, and let's get started. The Red Hollow stage stop had no reason to exist except that it did a single building of rough-hewn logs hunched against the Wyoming border like a man who had given up on standing straight. It served travelers moving between territories, a waypoint between places that mattered, and it had the particular desolation of somewhere that had seen too many desperate people pass through to feel anything about one more. Margaret Calloway had memorized every crack in the porch boards. She had counted the nail heads in the hitching post, 14, and traced the faded lettering of the sign above the door until she could reproduce it with her eyes closed. Red Hollow Station, Ernst, 1871. She had watched the same hawks circle the same updraft above the same ridge every afternoon at the same hour. She had learned the rhythm of this place the way prisoners learn the rhythm of their cells, not because it brought comfort, but because the mind needs something to hold on to when everything else is let go. 3 days. She had traveled 1,100 miles on the belief that Daniel Rourke was real. Philadelphia to Pittsburgh by rail, Pittsburgh west through Ohio and Indiana, the long, grinding passage across the plains, the stagecoach north into Wyoming territory, 4 days of bone-rattling motion of dust in her teeth and wind in her eyes, and the particular ache of someone who has committed entirely to a direction and cannot turn back. She had given notice at the Fairchild Academy for Young Ladies in April. She had vacated her rooms in June. She had spent July and August in careful preparation, selling what wouldn't travel, packing what would, and reading Daniel's letters so many times that certain phrases had worn grooves in her memory, like water cutting stone. "My dearest Margaret, I count the miles that separate us and find them unbearable. When you arrive at Red Hollow on the 15th of October, I will be there. I will be standing at the hitching post with a blue kerchief in my breast pocket, so you will know me at once, though I think I would know you in any crowd. A woman who writes as you do, who thinks as you do, who has survived what you have survived, she carries herself differently. I will see you from 100 yards away, and I will not mistake you for anyone else." He had not been at the hitching post. He had not been anywhere. There had been a man at the Nebraska way station, a friendly man, well-dressed, who had offered to carry her trunk when the stagecoach made its scheduled stop. He had seemed kind. He had seemed trustworthy. When she had reboarded the stage 20 minutes later, her leather satchel, the one she had kept tucked under her arm for 1,100 miles, was 3 pounds lighter and 4 years of her life shorter. The satchel was still there. The money was gone. She had not cried then either. She had sat very still in the swaying coach and calculated what she had left, And when the calculation was finished, she had looked out the window at the Nebraska flatlands and thought, I will figure this out. I always figure things out. It was the thing she had told herself after Thomas died, after the creditors came after the school board had looked at her across a long table and explained with genuine sympathies that a widow of 28 with no family connections and a half-paid mortgage had limited options. She had always figured things out. She had not yet figured this one out. Miss Calloway. Silas Greer's voice came from the doorway. A barrel-chested man in his 60s, gray-bearded with eyes that had the particular flatness of someone who had run out of patience for other people's misfortunes long before she arrived. He was not unkind. He was simply finished. Mr. Greer. She did not turn. It's Friday. I'm aware of the day. He came out onto the porch, his boots heavy on the boards. Stage comes through tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. I know. I need the room, Miss Calloway, and I need what you owe me. He paused. $4 for 3 nights and 3 days of meals. The wind came off the mountains in a long, cold gust. Margaret felt it find the gap between her collar and her neck and settle there. Somewhere behind the ridge, winter was waiting with the patience of something that did not need to hurry. I can wire my family, she said. The words tasted like ash. She had no family in any meaningful sense. Her parents were 10 years dead. Her one brother estranged in a dispute over their mother's estate that she had been too tired to fight. But Silas Greer didn't know that. In Philadelphia, they could send money within the week. Within the week, he repeated it without inflection. And in the meantime, she had no answer. The 11 cents in her pocket were not an answer. They were barely an acknowledgement that the question existed. Silas was still standing there, arms crossed, when the sound reached them both from the western road. Hoofbeats unhurried, the easy rhythm of a horse ridden by someone who knew where he was going and wasn't in any particular rush to get there. The horse was gray, deep-chested, with the kind of muscle that came from long distances rather than short speed. The man in the saddle sat with the relaxed economy of someone who had spent more of his life on horseback than off its shoulders, easy hands light on the reins, hat pulled low against the afternoon glare. He was perhaps 34, with a face that the Wyoming sun had worked on considerably angular jawlines at the corners of pale eyes, a mouth that held itself in a line that was neither warm nor cold, but simply watchful. He reined in at the hitching post and dismounted in a single fluid motion. His boots hit the ground with the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly where he stood. Silas, his voice was low, carrying without effort. Calhoun. The station keeper's posture shifted, still guarded, but with an undertone of something that might have been respect. Didn't expect you this direction. Business. The man Calhoun looped his horse's reins around the post and stepped up onto the porch. His gaze moved across Margaret with the brief, thorough assessment of someone cataloging the world for potential complications, then moved on. You have coffee. Always have coffee. They moved past her and into the station. Margaret listened to the door close behind them, heard the murmur of voices and the sound of a cup being filled, and felt something cold and separate from the wind settle in her chest. She had become part of the furniture. A fixture of the station no more noteworthy than the cracked water barrel or the faded sign, a problem in the shape of a woman waiting to be disposed of. She turned back to the horizon and resumed the vigil she no longer believed in. Inside, Ethan Calhoun wrapped both hands around a tin cup of coffee that was stronger than he needed and drank half of it before he said anything else. He had been riding for 2 days. Before that, 3 weeks of cold trails and wrong turns through southeastern Wyoming, following a name that changed the way water changed shape, always the same substance, never the same form. Grant Holloway, Daniel Rourke, Edward Marsh, William Sterling. The man had more names than a patent medicine salesman and considerably more damage to account for. The woman outside, he said, keeping his voice level. How long? Silas settled into the chair across the rough table, his own cup in hand. 3 days. Came in on Tuesday's stage from the south. Said she was meeting her fiancé. The station keeper's mouth turned. He ain't come. She have a name. Calloway. Margaret Calloway. From Philadelphia by the sound of her. Silas shook his head slowly. Educated woman. Proper. Smart enough to know better, I'd have thought, but they always are. That's the thing about it. It ain't the foolish ones he goes after. Ethan's hand had gone very still around his cup. This fiancé, he said carefully. He have a name. She called him Daniel Rourke. Silas watched him. The station keeper had lived long enough and seen enough to recognize when a name landed differently than expected. You know it. Ethan set his cup down with the precision of a man managing something that wanted to be less controlled. I know it. The silence in the room had a particular weight to it. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves with a sound like something that couldn't find a way in. He's not coming, Ethan said. It was not a question. No, he ain't. Ethan stood and moved to the window. Through the warped glass, he could see the woman on the bench. She was sitting very straight, the posture of someone who had decided that dignity was the only currency she had left and intended to spend it carefully. Even at this distance and borrowed light through old glass, he could see something in the set of her shoulders that was not defeat. It was stubbornness. The particular stubbornness of a person who has run out of hope but not yet run out of spine. He had seen that posture before. He had seen it on his sister Anna's face the last time he'd visited her in California, that careful rigidity of a woman holding herself together by sheer determination while everything underneath was coming apart. That had been 14 months before Anna died. How much does she owe you? He asked. $4. Ethan reached into his coat. Calhoun, you don't have to. I know I don't. He counted out the bills and set them on the table without looking at Silas's expression. I need to talk to her. There. The footsteps behind her were not Silas Greer's. Margaret knew Silas's step by now, heavy, deliberate, the walk of a man who owned every board he stood on. These were different, measured, unhurried in a way that was somehow more purposeful than hurry. She did not turn around. I'm not in the mood for conversation, she said. That's fine. The voice was the same low, carrying voice she'd heard from the porch. You don't need to talk. You just need to listen. Something in the way he said it, not unkind, not pitying, simply matter of fact, made her look over her shoulder. He had stopped a few feet behind the bench. His hat was pushed back slightly, and she could see his eyes clearly for the first time. They were a pale gray, the color of sky before snow, and they held something she hadn't expected to find in a stranger's face. Not pity, not judgment, recognition. Daniel Rourke isn't coming, he said. He was never coming. The man you traveled 1,100 miles to meet is a confidence artist who has been running variations of the same scheme across 5 territories for the better part of a decade. He courts women through correspondence, educated women, respectable women, women with savings, and the particular loneliness that comes from having built a careful life alone. He makes promises through letters. He arranges meetings. And before those women ever reach their destination, an accomplice relieves them of everything they were carrying. Margaret's mouth had gone dry. A man in Nebraska, she said. It was barely a whisper. He offered to help with my trunk. His name is probably Harlan Cross. He works the rail stops. Ethan's voice was flat, factual, like a man reading from a ledger. He's been with Rourke, whose real name is Grant Holloway, for at least 4 years. I've been looking for both of them. She stood. Her legs were steadier than she expected. Why are you telling me this? He was quiet for a moment. His gaze moved to the mountains behind her, the dark line of peaks against the graying afternoon sky, and something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, more like a lock turning. Because my sister Anna answered an advertisement in a San Francisco newspaper 3 years ago, he said. She was 24 years old. She believed every word he wrote. She traveled to Montana Territory with $4,000 she had saved over 7 years, and she never met the man who had written those letters because the money was gone before she reached him. He paused. She came home to California. She spent 14 months trying to recover from the shame of it, from believing she had been a fool, from the weight of having been so thoroughly deceived. She was not a fool. She was a woman who wanted something more than what her life had given her, and he saw that want and used it. Margaret waited. Anna died 14 months after she came home. His voice did not waver. She made a choice about that herself. By the time I found out how bad things had gotten, it was already too late. The wind gusted cold and sharp. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. I'm sorry was true, but insufficient. Everything true felt insufficient against the particular weight of what he had just told her. I've been looking for Grant Holloway ever since, Ethan said. I have a list of 9 women he's destroyed. You're number 7 on that list, Miss Calloway. I came here because I knew you'd be here and I knew you'd have nothing left when I arrived. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper. I own a ranch in Wyoming, the Double C, about 60 miles south of here. I need someone to manage the books. The accounts are in a state that would embarrass a blind man, and I've been too busy following a ghost to fix them. I'm offering you a position. $35 a month, room and board included, your own quarters. Full access to all ranch records. He set the paper on the bench beside her. If after a week you decide you'd rather take your chances elsewhere, I'll pay your stage fare to wherever you want to go. Margaret looked at the paper without touching it. You knew my name before you asked Silas, she said. He didn't look away. Yes, you knew I'd be here. I've been following his pattern for 3 years. I knew you'd answered his advertisement. I knew the date he'd told you to arrive. Then you came here to find me specifically. I came here because you were going to be stranded with nothing, and I've watched what happens to women in that situation when there's no one there. He said it without apology, without softening. I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you work that needs doing and fair pay for doing it. What I'm not able to offer is any particular reason to trust me because I'm a stranger and you've just spent 3 days learning what happens when you trust strangers. Margaret stood very still. The paper sat on the bench between them, white against the weathered gray wood. How much does he owe me? She asked finally. The question came out differently than she'd intended, not about Ethan, not about the job, about Holloway, about the calculation of it. $3,800, Ethan said. That's what you brought based on what I know about his method. He would have had someone watch your departure in Philadelphia and send word ahead. He knows exactly what you were carrying. She had told Daniel Rourke about her savings in a letter in March. She had described the number $3,800 as the foundation of their future together. The thing she had built through 4 years of careful teaching and careful living, the money that would go toward the land and the house and the new life they would share. She had told him with pride because it had felt like evidence that she was serious, that she was capable, that she was bringing something real to a real partnership. He had used it to calculate her worth as a target. I'll need to see the contract, she said. Something in Ethan Calhoun's expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but the particular stillness of a man who has been holding his breath and has just quietly exhaled. He reached into his coat again and produced a second folded document. He held it out. She took it. She read every word. The language was straightforward, the terms exactly as he described, the wage and conditions clearly stated. A standard employment contract for a ranch bookkeeper. She had reviewed enough school administrative contracts to recognize the difference between language that protected both parties and language that protected only one. This one was fair. She folded it and looked up at him. When do we leave? First light tomorrow. She nodded once. Mr. Calhoun. Ethan. Mr. Calhoun, she repeated with the deliberate precision of a woman establishing terms. I want you to understand something. I don't know you. I have no particular reason to believe you are who you say you are or that this situation is what you say it is. I'm accepting this offer because I have 11 cents in my pocket and winter coming and no better option. If that changes, if I find any reason to believe I've been deceived a second time, I will not handle it with silence. She held his gaze. I want that understood clearly. Ethan Calhoun looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his pale eyes, not offense, not surprise. Something that looked distantly like respect. Understood, he said, completely. He went back inside. Margaret stood alone on the porch with the contract in her hand and 11 cents in her pocket, and for the first time in 3 days, the horizon looked like something other than a place where hope went to die. She did not trust him. She could not afford to trust him, not yet, not after everything, but she trusted the contract. She trusted the clear terms and the absence of flourish. She trusted the way he had not tried to reassure her when she'd made her position plain. Daniel Rourke had offered her poetry. This man had offered her a ledger. She wasn't sure yet which was more reliable, but she was going to find out. The room Silas's wife showed her to that evening was small and cold, narrow-bed washstand with a basin that had a hairline crack running from rim to bottom, a window that looked out on the stable yard where the gray horse stood in patient stillness. But there was a fire in the small stove, and after 3 nights of sleeping, sitting up on the bench outside the mattress felt like something from a different world entirely. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without undressing. She took out the contract and read it again, though she had already memorized it. Then she took out the tattered piece of paper she'd been carrying since Nebraska, the one she'd retrieved from the floor of the stagecoach without fully understanding why. A list of 9 names, cities, dates, dollar amounts. Her name was number 7, Margaret Calloway. Philadelphia, October 15th, 1882, $3,800. She ran her finger down the other names. Women from California, from Missouri, from Georgia, from Ohio. Different cities, different amounts, different dates, spanning what appeared to be nearly a decade of careful, methodical destruction. The earliest entry was from 1873. 9 years. 9 women that this man, Ethan Calhoun, had been tracking. And probably more that he hadn't found yet. She thought about the way he'd said number 7, not as a way of diminishing her, as a way of telling her plainly that she was not alone in this, that there was a pattern and she had not invented her own destruction from some personal failing. She put the list away and took out her small notebook, the one she'd carried for 6 years through Thomas's death and the creditors and the long, slow rebuilding of a life that had been half completed when fate had taken its most essential piece. She wrote a single line, Thomas, Monday, March 14th, my number 7 did not come home. She wrote it every night. She had written it in hotels and boarding houses and stagecoaches, and for the past 3 nights on a broken bench under a Montana sky. It was not grief exactly. Grief had a different texture, softer and more consuming. This was more like keeping an account, a record of someone who had been real set down in writing so that the reality of him did not blur at the edges in the way that memories did when left unanchored. She capped the pen and closed the notebook. Outside, she heard footsteps on the gravel, unhurried, heading toward the stable. She looked through the window and saw Ethan Calhoun cross the yard in the last gray light. He stopped at the stable door, then turned slightly, and she realized with a small start that he was looking at her window. Not at her. He could not have seen her through the dark glass, but he paused there, his hand on the stable door, his face turned toward the light from her room. A moment, nothing more. Then he went inside. Margaret remained at the window a while longer, watching the yard go dark. She was done with men who wrote beautiful letters. She would see what this one looked like in daylight, with ledgers between them and plain speech on the table. That seemed at the moment like sufficient evidence to wait for. Dawn broke pale and thin over the Red Hollow station, and Margaret was already up. She had slept better than she expected, the sleep of pure exhaustion, the kind that doesn't leave room for dreams. She dressed in the warmest clothes she had, pinned her dark hair back with the practical efficiency of a woman who had never had much patience for ornamentation, and went downstairs to find Silas's wife setting out coffee and cold biscuits. Mr. Calhoun's already in the stable, the woman said without being asked. Her name was Ruth, and she had the worn, capable look of someone who kept a difficult household running through sheer refusal to stop. You'll want to eat before you go. Long ride south. How long? 2 days riding steady, one if he pushes it. Ruth set a cup of coffee in front of her. He won't push it. Margaret ate without tasting much. She was thinking about the list, 9 names, 9 women, and about what it said about a man that he would spend 3 years tracking, something like that. Not law enforcement, not a professional, just a man who had made a promise to someone who was no longer alive to receive it. The stable was already busy with light when she pushed the door open. Ethan was saddling a second horse, a roan mare, compact and solid-looking, with large dark eyes that moved to Margaret with calm, immediate interest. This is Cora, Ethan said without turning. She's dependable. Do you ride? Passably. She had ridden as a girl summers at her grandmother's farm in Lancaster County. It had been 12 years. I won't fall off. That's enough. He helped her check the saddle without comment, adjusting the stirrups to her height, with the matter-of-fact competence of someone for whom horses were furniture rather than occasion. When they rode out of the Red Hollow yard 15 minutes later, the sun was barely above the ridgeline, and the cold had the crystalline quality of early winter, sharp, clean, almost beautiful in the way that painful things sometimes were. They rode south in silence for the first hour. Margaret found her body remembering the motion before her mind did the balance, the adjustment, the particular rhythm of trusting an animal's movement beneath you. Cora was patient with her relearning, which she appreciated. The Wyoming landscape opened around them in every direction. Golden grassland running to the base of dark foothills, the sky above them an enormous cloudless blue. In Philadelphia, the tallest things she could see from her bedroom window were the bell tower of St. Michael's and the chimney stacks of the mills on the river. Here the mountains filled the western horizon like a wall built by something indifferent to human scale. It's larger than I expected, she said, the first words either of them had spoken. Most people think that. In Philadelphia, large means crowded. This is the opposite of that. He glanced at her briefly, something in his expression, not quite a smile, but an adjacent movement. You'll get used to it, or you won't. Some people find it peaceful, some find it suffocating. Which did you find it? Both, he said, depending on the year. They rode in silence again. It was not an uncomfortable silence, more the silence of two people who had run out of the kind of conversation that serves as weather and hadn't yet decided whether to try for something more substantial. It was Margaret who broke it. "The list," she said. "The 9 names. How long have you been building it?" He didn't look at her. "Since 6 months after Anna died. And you found all of them, or 9? 7. 2 I haven't been able to locate. Either they moved or they're—" He stopped. "Or they made the same choice Anna did." "Yes." The word fell between them and lay there. Margaret watched a hawk rise from a fence post half a mile ahead and turn south on the wind. "The man who took my money in Nebraska," she said. "Harlan Cross, is he still—" "He's still working for Holloway, as far as I know." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "I haven't been able to get to him without alerting Holloway first, and Holloway disappears the moment he thinks someone is close. He has a network of people who warn him, including someone at Double C." The question came out before she'd fully formed it. She wasn't sure where it had come from. Some instinct, some small note of dissonance in something she couldn't yet articulate. Ethan looked at her then. The pale eyes were steady, reading something in her face. "What makes you ask that?" "Nothing specific. The fact that he knew I'd answered his advertisement, knew what I was carrying, knew my travel route. That level of information implies someone who watches the communities he works in. Communities include ranches." She paused. "It's a question, not an accusation." He was quiet for a moment. "It's a good question," he said finally. "I've thought about it." He didn't say more than that. Margaret let it rest. She had planted the question. That was enough for now. They made camp that first night beside a narrow creek running through a stand of cottonwoods, gone gold with autumn. Ethan built the fire with efficient, practiced movements, while Margaret unsaddled Cora and rubbed her down her hands relearning the work. They ate dried beef and hard biscuits in the firelight without much conversation. The sky above them was immense and crowded with stars, more than Margaret had known existed, more than could be seen from any city. A staggering abundance of light that made the darkness feel less empty rather than more. "Anna," she said, not asking, just saying the name. Ethan looked up from the fire. What was she like before? He was silent long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "She laughed at things I didn't think were funny." She was always doing that, finding the absurd in things, the small, ridiculous moments that I was too serious to notice. A pause. "She was better at people than I was, easier with them. I could run a ranch, manage accounts, negotiate with buyers. She could walk into a room full of strangers and leave 2 hours later knowing everyone's name and something real about each of them." "She sounds like someone worth knowing." She was. His voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when the only alternative is to break. "She answered his advertisement because she'd been in love once before a man who chose someone else. And I think the letters made her feel like maybe that wasn't the end of things. Like maybe it could still happen." He looked at the fire. "That's what he does. He finds the place where someone has already been hurt, and he builds his letters around it. He gives back in words exactly the thing that was taken." Margaret thought about the green ribbon, the 37 no 29 letters, the specific careful way Daniel Rourke had written about her students, her love of numbers, the particular independence she had fought to build after Thomas died. He had read her and written back a version of herself that was seen and valued and exactly right. "He told me I carried myself differently," she said, "that he would recognize me in any crowd, that a woman who had survived what I had survived was, I believe the word he used was remarkable. He told Anna she had an unusual mind. He's very good. He's had years of practice." Ethan added a branch to the fire. "And he reads people well enough to know exactly which door to open." Margaret stared at the flames. Somewhere in the cottonwoods a nightbird called once and went silent. "Mr. Calhoun," she said, "what do you intend to do when you find him?" He looked up. "I mean specifically," she said, "not in general terms. If you find Grant Holloway, what happens?" The fire popped. A log shifted and sent a small constellation of sparks upward into the cold air. "There are warrants," he said carefully, "in 3 territories, fraud, theft, conspiracy. If I can get him in front of a territorial marshal, the law takes over. And if you can't—" The pause was half a beat too long. "I intend to get him in front of a marshal," he said. Margaret nodded slowly, filing the non-answer where it belonged. She did not press further. She understood that some questions were better left in the space between what was said and what was meant, at least until she knew more about the man she was riding south with. She banked her side of the fire and wrapped herself in her bedroll, watching the stars through the bare branches overhead. 11 cents. 3 days on a broken bench. One contract with fair terms and a stranger who hunted men by their handwriting and their patterns. She had survived worse beginnings. Thomas had been a coal miner's son with $10 to his name when she'd met him, and they had built something real from that. She would figure this out. She always figured things out. Double C Ranch came into view on the afternoon of the second day, a sprawl of buildings in a wide valley between two ridges backed by mountains that turned blue-gray in the afternoon light. The main house was long and low-built for function rather than impression, with a covered porch running the full length of the front. Beyond it, a barn twice its size corrals where horses moved in slow circles, in pasture land, stretching in every direction to the feet of the hills. It was solid, unapologetic, built to last by someone who had no interest in appearance and every interest in endurance. Margaret found to her mild surprise that she liked it immediately. A man was waiting at the corral gate as they rode in, perhaps 60, built like a fence post, driven deep into rocky ground, with a face that had been weathered to the consistency of old leather and eyes the color of winter creek water. He watched their approach with the kind of stillness that was not calm but evaluation. "Dooley," Ethan said, reining in, "we have company." Frank Dooley's eyes moved to Margaret with the slow, comprehensive examination of a man who has seen many things he did not need and is thoroughly prepared to add another to the list. "So I see. Miss Calloway will be managing the accounts." "The accounts." He repeated it with the flat inflection of a man who has been told something he considers wrong, but has chosen not to argue about yet. "Right." Margaret dismounted with more grace than she'd managed at any point in the previous 2 days of riding, walked Cora to the fence rail and looped the reins with practiced efficiency. Then she turned and met Frank Dooley's gaze directly. "Mr. Dooley," she said, "I understand you have concerns about a stranger arriving without warning to work with the ranch records. I would have the same concerns in your position. I can tell you that I'm here to work, that I have no interest in disrupting operations, and that I intend to do the job I was hired to do and nothing more." She paused. "If you'd like to discuss your concerns specifically, I'm happy to do that now." Something shifted in Frank Dooley's expression. Not warmth, but the faint, involuntary recognition of someone who has been spoken to in their own language. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back with the expression of a man who had said all he intended to say on the subject. Dooley turned back to Margaret. "The accounts," he said again with slightly different inflection this time, "are a disaster. I've been told. He lost $300 last spring and still ain't found it." "I'm aware." Dooley squinted at her. "You find my $300 and maybe we'll talk." He turned and walked toward the barn. "I got a horse with a shoe coming loose that matters more to me right now than ledgers." It was Margaret understood the closest thing to a welcome she was going to get from Frank Dooley. "He'll come around," Ethan said quietly beside her. "He doesn't need to come around," Margaret said, watching Dooley disappear into the barn. "He needs to stay out of the account books. Those are different things." A sound came from behind the main house, something between a thud and a controlled crash, followed by silence, followed by what might have been a muttered oath. They walked around the corner to find a girl of perhaps 17 with copper-red hair and a face full of freckles, standing beside an overturned stack of firewood, examining her palm with the critical interest of someone taking inventory. She looked up. Her eyes were green, the particular clear green of shallow water over pale stone, and they moved to Margaret with an expression that was not wariness or welcome, but something more specific. A careful measuring look, like someone who has learned to assess situations quickly because the cost of misjudging them has been high. "You're from the East," the girl said. It was not a question. "Philadelphia," Margaret said. "You." The girl bent to begin restacking the wood. "I was born here. My mother came from Tennessee." She didn't look up. "She came west to meet a man. He wasn't here when she arrived." The words landed between them like stones in still water. Margaret bent and picked up a length of firewood. She stacked it without comment. The girl glanced at her sideways. "My name is Lily." "Margaret, most people call me Meg. Most people call me Lily." A pause. "Which is just my name, not a shortening of anything." They finished restacking the wood in silence that had somehow become, in the space of 2 minutes, not uncomfortable. When they were done, Lily straightened and pushed her hair out of her eyes and looked at Margaret with that same careful assessment. "You're going to look at the account books," she said. "Yes. Frank thinks it's a waste of time. Frank is allowed to think what he likes about his time. I'll be thinking about the account books." Something shifted in Lily's expression, not quite a smile, but the movement of a face that was deciding whether to allow one. "Supper's at 6, she said. "I cook Mondays and Wednesdays. Don't complain about the biscuits." I wouldn't dream of it. Lily nodded once and carried an armload of wood toward the kitchen door. At the threshold, she paused without turning. My mother's name was Sarah, she said. She came from a place called Mill Haven in Tennessee. She was going to marry a man named William Marsh. A beat. He never came either. She went inside. Margaret stood in the cold Wyoming afternoon and felt something turn over in her chest, a slow, heavy recognition. William Marsh. She had seen that name. On the list in her pocket, 3 entries above her own. Sarah Perkins, Mill Haven, Tennessee, June 1876. $1,200. Lily was 17. 1876 was 6 years ago. If Sarah Perkins had been pregnant when she arrived, the cold deepened around Margaret's shoulders. She stood there a moment longer, looking at the kitchen door, and thought about the particular way that some debts were not expressed in dollars. Then she went inside to look at the account books. The account books were, as Frank Dooley had promised, a disaster. Not the chaotic disaster of someone who didn't care. That would have been easier. This was the disaster of someone who cared very much, who had attempted to maintain records through the accumulated pressure of running a large cattle operation largely alone, and who had gradually fallen behind until behind became hopelessly behind, and hopelessly behind became something that looked at a glance like catastrophe. Margaret spread the ledgers across the long table in the room Ethan used as an office, a spare functional space with one window facing the mountains, a wall of rough shelves holding books and papers, and a locked wooden drawer. She noted without touching and spent her first evening at Double C simply reading. She did not try to fix anything that first night. She read. She traced the logic of the recording system, such as it was. She identified the points where the thread of entry broke and resumed in a different hand at a different angle with different ink. Small signs of interruption of seasons, when the records had been abandoned for more pressing work and taken up again later from imperfect memory. By 10 o'clock, she had a clear map of the damage. By 11, she had a preliminary sense of what was recoverable. By midnight, she had found the missing $300. It was not strictly speaking missing. It had been recorded under the wrong supplier category, a delivery of lumber tallied against the grain account, which had thrown off every subsequent calculation in a cascade of small errors that compounded over 6 months into a number that looked like loss, but was actually misplacement. She found it the way she always found misplaced things, by going back to the beginning and following every thread to its end, without assuming she knew where it was going. She wrote the correction into the margin in her neat, precise hand and closed the ledger at midnight. The house was very quiet. Through the window, the moonlit mountains were silver-white, enormous, indifferent. She could hear faintly the sound of horses shifting in the stable. She took out her notebook. Thomas. Monday, March 14th, mine number 7, did not come home. She sat with the words a moment, then added beneath them, for the first time in 6 years of nightly writing, I found something today I thought was lost. It was never gone, just recorded wrong. She capped the pen. She did not know exactly what she meant by it. She knew it was true. She gave Frank Dooley his $300 the next morning. Not the money itself. She placed a single sheet of paper on the kitchen table beside his coffee cup, while he was still reading it, with the corrected entry clearly marked and the chain of the error traced step by step in plain language. She did not wait for a response. She had other things to read. He found her in the office 2 hours later. She heard the footsteps in the hall, heavier, more deliberate than usual, and kept her eyes on the grain supplier account she was reconciling. You found it, he said. Lumber was filed under grain. February accounts. She did not look up. Classic cascade error. Once the initial entry was wrong, everything after was calculating from a false base. Silence from the doorway. Then Ethan looked at those books for 2 weeks. He was looking for a loss. I was looking for a misplacement. Different question gets a different answer. Another silence, different in quality from the first. Frank Dooley came into the room and sat down in the chair across the table from her, which was the chair Ethan used and which Frank had conspicuously not sat in during their introduction. He set both hands on his knees and looked at her with an expression that had shed some of its granite quality. What else do you see? He asked. She set down her pen. She looked at him directly. How much do you want to know? He held her gaze. All of it, she told him. Not everything. She needed another week to be certain of everything, but the shape of it, the livestock account discrepancies that went back 8 months, the supply invoices from a broker named Victor Crane that did not match the quantities recorded in the stock, tallies the contract entries in a hand she didn't recognize that differed from Ethan's recording system in ways that were too consistent to be accidental. She watched his face as she spoke. The expression moved through several things: skepticism, attention, recognition, something harder and colder at the end that was not quite anger, but in the same neighborhood. "Crane," he said. "Victor Crane, you know him. He's been Double C's livestock broker for 4 years." Frank's jaw had tightened. "Good terms. Good prices. Or so we thought." He was quiet a moment. "And the contracts, that's Webb's hand, Aldous Webb. He handles the paperwork for incoming supply agreements. He's been employed here how long?" "About a year." Something moved in Frank's eyes, a memory connecting with a suspicion. "About a year," he repeated with different weight. Margaret picked up her pen. "I'll need another 5 days to have exact figures. But if you want my preliminary estimate, give it." Crane has been invoicing Double C for approximately 40% more livestock than he's actually delivering. Webb's contract entries record the inflated amounts as received, which means the discrepancy never appeared as a loss. It appeared as normal cost. She paused. "Over 8 months, based on the numbers I've seen so far, I estimate the overcharge at somewhere between $800 and $1,200. Frank Dooley sat very still. "I'll need to see the physical stock tallies to confirm," Margaret said, "cross-referenced with the pasture counts for the same periods." "I'll get you the tallies." He stood. His hands, she noticed, had closed into loose fists on his knees before he rose. "Miss Calloway." She looked up. He didn't say anything for a moment. He had the look of a man assembling something, not words exactly, more like the decision to say what the words were going to express. "You're good at this," he said finally. "I've always been good with numbers." She returned her attention to the ledger. "The numbers were always honest. It's the people entering them who decide whether the records will be." He left. She heard his boots on the hallway floor slowing slightly as he passed the office door, then continuing on. She found the second problem 3 days later. She had been working late, as had become her custom, the office quiet, the ranch settling into its nighttime rhythms, the mountains dark against a sky full of stars. She was cross-referencing the contract entries with the original supply agreements when she noticed something in the signature block of a livestock transfer agreement from the previous April. The contract had been drawn up by Aldous Webb. His handwriting was distinctive, a particular formation of the capital letter D, with a loop that ran back under the baseline before completing the stroke. She had seen that formation before, not in the ranch records. In her own correspondence, the letters tied with a green ribbon that she had not opened since Nebraska, that she had carried in the bottom of her trunk because she could not yet decide whether to burn them or keep them as evidence. The letters from Daniel Rourke. The capital D in Daniel had the same back-looping formation. She sat very still for a long time. She was not certain. She had not been trained as a documents examiner. Handwriting could be coincidental. Individual formations were not as unique as she'd like them to be. She needed more samples, more comparison, before she could be confident. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the list of 9 names. Her finger moved down the column of amounts and dates. Sarah Perkins, Millhaven, Tennessee. June 1876, $1,200. Lily, 17 years old, copper hair and green eyes, and a mother named Sarah who had come to Wyoming for a man named William Marsh and had not found him there. If Webb was connected to Holloway, if Webb had been placed at Double C, specifically as part of a network, then Holloway's operation was not a series of independent crimes but a system. A sustained, coordinated system with inside people in multiple communities watching, reporting, providing information that helped Holloway choose his targets. She thought about Ethan's question on the second day of writing. "I've thought about it." He knew, or suspected. He had placed her near the accounts deliberately, not only because they needed managing, but because a pair of fresh eyes might see what his own had stopped seeing. She was not sure how she felt about that. About being used even usefully without full disclosure of the reason. She put the list away and returned to the contracts. She had more work to do before she could bring this to Ethan with anything beyond suspicion. 2 nights later, she found the letter. She had not meant to look in Aldous Webb's office. Webb was not at the ranch that day. He made regular trips to Laramie for supply negotiations, a schedule Margaret had noted was convenient for a man with reasons to be elsewhere periodically. She had gone to his office to retrieve a set of invoices he had promised Frank the previous week, and the door was unlocked. The invoices were on the desk. She took them. The desk drawer was slightly open. She should not have looked inside. She looked inside. The letter was not hidden. It was simply buried under other papers, as though it had been put down in haste and covered without deliberate concealment. An unsealed envelope addressed in a hand she recognized immediately because she had memorized that hand from 37 letters read in a Philadelphia apartment with insufficient winter light. For Miss M. Calloway, Double C Ranch, Wyoming Territory. Her name in Holloway's hand on a letter addressed to this ranch, written and addressed before she had even arrived at Red Hollow Station, before she had been stranded, before Ethan had found her and brought her here. Someone had told Holloway where she was going. Her hands were steady as she opened it. Steadiness was a choice she had learned, not a feeling, but a decision held in place by the knowledge that falling apart was a luxury that required time she did not currently have. "My dear Margaret," it began, "by the time this letter reaches you, if it reaches you, you will have understood that I was unable to meet you as promised. I hope you will understand that circumstances beyond my control." She stopped reading. She turned the envelope over in her hands. Postmarked Cheyenne. 3 weeks ago, a week before she had departed Philadelphia. He had known she would end up here. He had written this before she arrived, before she'd been stranded, before Ethan had found her. He had known Ethan would find her, or someone would, and that she would end up at Double C. She thought about the last line of the portion she had read. "I read every letter you sent me. I know you better than you think." She folded the letter. She put it in her coat pocket. She put the invoices under her arm and walked back to the main house. In the kitchen, the fire was burning. She opened the door of the stove and fed Holloway's letter into it and stood watching until there was nothing left but ash. Then she went back to the account books, because the account books were something she could fix, and she needed very badly to be doing something she could fix. "Data," she told Ethan that evening. Not about the letter, about Webb, the handwriting, the connection to Holloway's signature, the pattern of the fraud. She told him precisely, methodically, the way she told him everything, beginning with what she knew, distinguishing clearly between what she had confirmed and what she suspected, ending with what she needed to verify. He listened without interrupting. He had that quality, a capacity for stillness when someone else was speaking, that made you feel your words were landing somewhere real, not just filling the air. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that the fire in the grate shifted and a log settled with a quiet sound. "How sure are you?" he asked. "About the fraud, certain. I have the invoices and the stock tallies. The numbers are unambiguous." She paused. "About the handwriting connection, the 70%. Enough that I wouldn't dismiss it. Not enough to bring it to a marshal on its own." Ethan stood and went to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she watched the tension in his shoulders, not the tension of someone surprised, but of someone receiving confirmation of what they had already feared. "The locked drawer," she said. He turned. "In your desk. I noticed it the first night. I haven't touched it." She met his gaze. "What's in it?" The silence was different from his usual silences. Heavier. Filled with something that had been carried a long time. He crossed to the desk. He took a key from the inside pocket of his coat and opened the drawer. He removed a document and placed it on the desk between them. It was a printed program, the kind distributed at public events. At the top, informal type, Wyoming Agricultural Association Fair, Cheyenne, September 1878. Below that, a list of speakers and presentations. Midway down the page, in clear black ink, special address, Mr. Grant D. Holloway, presented by Mr. Ethan J. Calhoun, Double C Ranch. Ethan's signature was at the bottom, clear, unmistakable. Margaret looked at the program. Then she looked at him. "I introduced him," Ethan said. The words came out with the particular flatness of something said so many times internally that the external saying of it had worn the emotion smooth. At the 1878 fair, he presented himself as a progressive rancher from Colorado, new irrigation techniques, range management, investment opportunities. He had references. He had recommendations from men I respected. A pause. He had my recommendation in writing sent to the fair organizers 2 months before the event. He was already running the scheme. I didn't know that, but yes, he had already destroyed 2 women that I know of before I introduced him to 300 ranchers and farmers and their families in Cheyenne. His voice did not waver. The steadiness of it was the worst part, the steadiness of a man who had decided he deserved to feel this and was not going to allow himself relief from it. After the fair, he had access to every community in southeastern Wyoming, every church bulletin board, every post office, every merchant who might know an eligible woman. I handed him a territory. "And Anna," Anna was in California. She never attended the fair. He used a different name with her, took a different route west. But the connections, the network that fed him names and addresses that grew from the introduction I made. He looked at the program. I've carried that since I found out, about 6 months after she died. Margaret looked at the document on the desk between them, the signature in clear black ink. Ethan J. Calhoun. She thought about what it would be like to carry that for 3 years. Not just grief, grief was survivable. The knowledge that your own action, your own endorsement had opened the door, that every woman on that list of 9 had been within reach of a destruction that had your name at its root. You couldn't have known, she said. I know that. His voice was still flat. Knowing that doesn't change what I know. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, the wind had picked up the sound of winter coming down from the mountains, with more intention than it had shown in weeks. Why did you keep it? She asked. The program. He looked at it. So I wouldn't forget what I owe. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She thought about Thomas, about the notebook entries, about the reason she kept writing his name every night, even though the grief had changed shape over the years, into something quieter and more permanent. About what it meant to carry a record of what you'd lost in order to keep the loss real. That's not what it's for, she said. You're using it as punishment, not memory. Those are different things. He looked at her and then something shifting in the pale eyes, some carefully maintained structure, developing very slightly a crack. He did not respond. He picked up the program and locked it back in the drawer with the deliberate movements of a man putting something away that he was not ready to set down. Webb's schedule, he said. When does he return from Laramie? Back to business. She let him have it. Thursday, she said. He told Frank he'd be back Thursday afternoon. I'll need everything documented before then. Complete figures on the crane fraud, the contract discrepancies, all of it. I'll have it by Wednesday evening. He nodded. He was looking at the desk drawer with an expression that was not quite pain and not quite anger, and was in the end something that had no clean name. Ethan, she said. He looked up. She had not used his first name before. She had called him Mr. Calhoun, consistently deliberate, measured the wall she had built. Thank you, she said, for the program, for telling me. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his coat from the hook by the door and went out into the cold Wyoming night, and Margaret stood in the office listening to his footsteps cross the porch and descend to the yard. She heard them stop. Through the window she could see him standing in the dark outside, not heading anywhere, just standing. A man who had just said out loud for what she suspected was the first time to anyone the thing he had been carrying alone for 3 years. She did not go to the window. She sat down at the desk, opened the ledger to Wednesday's work, and left him the darkness. Some things needed to be carried a little longer before they could be set down. She knew that better than most. The trap was her idea. Webb was due back Thursday. By Wednesday evening, Margaret had her figures. Victor Crane had overcharged Double C by $1,140 over 8 months, with Webb's contract entries adjusted to conceal the shortfall. She had it documented in a way that would satisfy any territorial marshal, clear-numbered, cross-referenced, impossible to dismiss as clerical error. But the connection to Holloway was still the soft part. Webb's handwriting was suggestive, not conclusive. She needed more. She thought about it Wednesday night while the rest of the ranch was asleep. About the letter that had arrived at Webb's desk before she had arrived at Double C. About Holloway's words, "I know you better than you think." About the particular arrogance of a man who believed he had already won, who had already written a letter to a woman who hadn't yet been stranded, who had already moved pieces into position before the game began. Arrogance was useful. Arrogance was a gap in the defense. She spoke to Ethan over breakfast before Frank or Lily were awake. Webb sends letters to Laramie, she said, regularly. Not just supply correspondence, personal letters. I've seen the outgoing mail book. He sends one to the same address approximately every 2 weeks. Ethan's cup paused halfway to his mouth. If he's reporting to Holloway, she continued, and we feed him false information before he leaves on his next scheduled trip, something specific and verifiable like a date and location for a cattle sale that Holloway's network might want to monitor, we can watch whether Holloway surfaces at that location. It would tell us whether Webb is the informant. It would confirm it. The false information would have to come from me casually in his hearing, as though I didn't know he was listening. She paused. I can do that. Ethan set his cup down. It puts you in his line of sight. I'm already in his line of sight. He knows I've been in the books. She held Ethan's gaze. He knows I may have found the fraud. If he is connected to Holloway, the question isn't whether I'm a target. It's whether we use that or wait for him to act first. The silence that followed had a particular quality, the silence of someone reassessing an assumption they hadn't known they were making. "You're not afraid of him," Ethan said. It was an observation, not a judgment. "I'm afraid of him," Margaret said precisely. "I'm choosing to be useful anyway. Those aren't the same thing." He looked at her for a long moment. The pale eyes moved through several things she couldn't fully read, then settled into something that was decision. "Wednesday," he said. "I'll arrange for Chester Briggs to hear it too." Chester Briggs, he tracks for me, has been with Double C about 2 months. A pause. "I want to know if information travels through more than one channel." Margaret noted this without comment. 2 months. She had her own thoughts about that timing. She filed them carefully. "Laramie," she said. "Thursday cattle sale. 50 head premium, Longhorns private buyer. Tell it in the yard where the sound carries." He nodded. "Wednesday afternoon, you tell Frank. Make it sound like you heard it from me." She rose from the table. "And when Webb returns Thursday, we watch who leaves." She told Frank in the yard on Wednesday while she was returning the stock tallies she'd borrowed for reconciliation. She mentioned the Laramie cattle sale the way you mentioned weather briefly, factually not quite looking at Frank because she was pretending to count the tallies in her hand. She said Ethan had a private buyer, 50 head Thursday. She did not look toward Webb's office window. She did not need to. That evening, she found Chester Briggs at the corral, checking his horse's shoes with the professional attention of a man who knows what neglect's on the trail. She repeated the information with slightly different framing. 50 head she'd heard Ethan talking to Frank Laramie buyer and watched his face with the peripheral attention she had learned from 6 years of reading students who thought they were inscrutable. Chester Briggs had an excellent face for a man with things to hide. He nodded without looking up from the hoof he was inspecting, asked a clarifying question that was too specific for idle curiosity, and resumed his work. Margaret returned to the house. Thursday morning before first light, she heard a horse leave the yard. She went to the window. The moon was down, but the stars gave enough light to see a figure on horseback moving south at a pace that was not a casual pre-dawn ride. The horse was Chester Briggs's bay, not Webb's horse, not in the direction of Laramie. She dressed in 4 minutes and went to wake Ethan. She found him already in the hallway, coat on, eyes alert, in the way of someone who had not been fully asleep. "Chester," she said, "I heard the horse." He was already moving toward the door. "Webb is still in his room, I checked. Chester asked me how many head last night. He was specific." Ethan stopped at the door. He turned. In the thin light from the hallway lamp, his face had a stillness that was different from its usual kind, not controlled but cold. The particular coldness of someone whose suspicion has just become certainty. 2 months, she said. He arrived 2 months ago. When did Holloway start sending you letters that seemed to know your movements? He looked at her. 2 months ago. She had already known. She had not yet been certain enough to say it. "He's heading south," Ethan said. "Not Laramie. South means Casper." "Holloway's in Casper." "Has been. Under a different name, I had word 3 weeks ago, but couldn't verify it without losing the trail on Webb." He was at the door. "I need to ride." "I know." She paused. "I'm coming." He looked at her in the way that meant he was about to say something reasonable about risk. "Ethan." She said it steadily. "He has my name in his records. He has a letter addressed to me that he was holding at this ranch. He knew I was coming here before I did. I am not going to wait on a porch for someone else to finish this." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. "Can you ride hard?" he asked. "I can ride." "That's not what I asked." "Yes," she said, "I can ride hard." They left the Double C in the gray half-light before dawn, with Frank watching from the porch with an expression that had moved through concern and resignation and arrived somewhere that looked distantly like trust. He had come to her door 10 minutes earlier while she was gathering her coat and Frank's old revolver that he'd pressed into her hands without ceremony or explanation. He hadn't explained it. He hadn't needed to. She had taken it. At the gate, Frank had said, "Don't let him sweet-talk his way clear. These men know how to talk." "I know how to listen," she said, "and how to stop." Frank had looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized now. The same expression he'd worn when she'd put the corrected ledger entry in front of him at breakfast 3 weeks ago. The expression of a man revising a calculation. He hadn't said anything else. He'd stepped back and let them ride. They rode hard the first 4 hours through country that grew rougher as the land lifted and fell toward Casper. The sky above them was the pale bone white of early winter, the kind of sky that makes no promises about what it's considering. By mid-morning, the wind had come up from the north with an edge that cut through wool and leather alike and Margaret's hands on the reins were cold in the particular way that meant the cold had been there long enough to stop announcing itself. She did not slow down. Cora had found her pace easily. The roan had a working horse's practicality. No protest in her, just the steady commitment of a good animal doing what it had been built for. Margaret's body had adapted to the riding over the past weeks at Double C in ways she hadn't noticed until now. When it mattered, her back held, her seat was firm, she did not fall behind. They made camp that first night beside the ruins of a way station that had been abandoned before Wyoming was a territory. 3 walls standing in the fourth collapsed in a neat fan of rotted lumber open to the sky in the cold. It provided enough shelter to build a fire without the wind taking it immediately, and that was enough. Ethan fed the horses while Margaret built the fire with the systematic efficiency she had applied to everything since Red Hollow. He watched her for a moment, his back to the wind, and said nothing. She had noticed he did that, watched her work without comment, without offering help unless it was needed, without the particular brand of observation that was actually evaluation. He watched the way you watch something that interested you. They ate in silence for a while, the fire building its warmth in the partial shelter of the broken walls, the stars beginning through the open section above them where the fourth wall had fallen. The rain, he said. She looked up. The sky to the north had a particular darkness that was not cloud in the usual sense. Sleet maybe, he said. There's a section of overhang on the east wall. We should move closer. They moved. The sleet came within 20 minutes, not violent but steady, the small, hard pellets making a sound on the lumber around them like someone reading out a list of grievances methodically without pause. It drove them both under the overhang, shoulders nearly touching in the narrow space where the roof had held. They sat like that for a while. The fire hissed when the sleet found it, then recovered. You wrote his name in your notebook, Ethan said. She had known he'd seen it. She had known from the second night at Red Hollow from the way he'd paused at the window, but she had waited to see if he would mention it or let it remain unspoken. Every night, she said. Thomas. Yes. The sleet came in a gust and subsided. He said, how? One word flat, not quite a question. How meaning, how did it happen? How did you survive it? How do you carry it? Like you carry it instead of like something that breaks you. A collapse in the number 7 shaft at a mine called Harlan Consolidated in eastern Pennsylvania. She kept her voice even. She had told this story enough times that it had acquired a shape, a container for the fact that kept it manageable. He was 31. We had been married 4 years. The company said it was equipment failure. The other family said the company had been warned about the shaft bracing 6 months before. A palaron. We never found out which was true. The company settled with all the families before it went to a formal inquiry. You fought it. I tried to. She watched the fire. I was 26 and had a school to keep running and no savings and no family close enough to matter. I fought it for 8 months, and then I made a calculation that the energy of fighting it was costing more than I could afford to spend. She looked at the overhang above them, at the old boards that had held for 40 years against every Wyoming wind and were still holding. So I stopped fighting and started rebuilding. That's when I started saving. 4 years, Ethan said, the $3,800. 4 years of careful living. No new clothes past necessity, no travel, no luxuries. I taught extra students on Saturdays for 2 years. She paused. I thought I was building a foundation. Turns out I was building a target. The fire found a dry section of log and brightened. In the new light, she could see his face, the angular lines of it, the pale eyes watching the flame with the focused attention of someone thinking about something other than fire. He hates them, Ethan said quietly. That's what I've concluded after 3 years. Not the money, he takes the money because it's useful, but it's not what drives him. He hates what they represent. Educated women, independent women, women who built something on their own. He takes that specifically, not accidentally. He paused. Anna had saved her money over 7 years working as a seamstress. She was extraordinary at it. She had her own clients, her own reputation. She was building toward opening her own shop. A beat. He read everything she wrote him. He knew exactly what she was building. And then he took it. Margaret was quiet for a moment watching the fire. Anh ấy hẳn là người tốt, Ethan said. She looked at him. He had been looking at the fire. He looked at her now. Your husband, he must have been a good man, the way you still write his name. He paused. I don't say that many things that aren't worth saying. She held that for a moment. It was the simplest thing anyone had said to her about Thomas in 6 years, and it found a place in her chest that the elaborate condolences and the careful sympathies had never quite reached. Not because it offered anything comfort absolution answers, but because it didn't try to. It just said he was real. I can tell. He was, she said. He was the kind of man who believed the world was basically fair and tried to prove it by treating it that way. She paused. I used to think that was naive. Now I think it was the hardest possible thing to be. The sleet had eased. The fire was steady. They sat in the narrow warmth of the overhang shelter, two people who had both lost something that couldn't be replaced and were still moving anyway, and the silence between them had changed not into warmth exactly, but into something that didn't need to be filled. Thank you, she said finally. He looked at her. For saying that, she turned back to the fire. About Thomas. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. She had learned to read his silences, which ones were withholding and which ones were simply full. This one was simply full. Casper on a Thursday in November looked like every other small Wyoming town in the slow collapse toward winter mud on the main street half frozen overnight and softening in the midday sun, storefronts with their signs weathered to patience. A population of people who had made a decision about this territory and were living with it in the particular way of people who are not given to second thoughts. The wool merchant's warehouse was on the east side of town, 1 block from the river. Margaret had expected something nondescript, forgettable, the natural habitat of a man who made himself easy to overlook. Instead, it was a solid double-doored building of rough-hewn stone, newer than most of the surrounding structures, with a sign above the door that read, Marsh and Associates Woolhides General Trade. Edward Marsh. She recognized it from the list. His third alias, at least the one he was currently running. They split at the corner as they had agreed. Ethan would go in the front, the direct approach, the expected approach, the one that might draw Holloway toward the back exit. Margaret circled around through the alley that ran behind the river-facing buildings, her coat pulled tight, Frank's revolver in her right coat pocket, with the hammer carefully positioned. She had never shot anyone. She did not intend to shoot anyone today. She intended to hold a door. The back exit of the warehouse was an iron door hinged outward with a drop bar on the inside and critically a padlock housing on the outside that had been left engaged, but unlocked the padlock hanging open in the housing. Someone used this exit regularly. Someone was accustomed to leaving quickly. She took up her position, 4 feet from the door, back to the stone wall and waited. Inside, she heard nothing for 30 seconds. Then footsteps, 2 sets uneven, the sound of a room being moved through quickly. Then a voice muffled by the stone but carrying Ethan's voice low certain. A response she couldn't make out. Then rapid footsteps moving toward the back of the building. She stepped into position in front of the door. The bar inside lifted. The door swung outward. A man came through it fast, looking back over his shoulder and stopped. Grant Holloway was perhaps 50, which surprised her. She had constructed someone younger in her mind from the letters, someone with the energy of youth behind the particular cruelty of his method. This man was 50, with a gray-threaded beard and the soft hands of someone who had spent decades not doing physical labor. His eyes were quick and intelligent and moved over her in a rapid calculating assessment. Then they moved to the revolver she had raised, and the calculation changed. Miss Calloway, he said. The voice was smooth, practiced, the voice that had been in the letters she realized with a visceral lurch, the particular cadence of it. My dear Margaret, I had hoped we would meet under better circumstances. I'm certain you did, she said. Her hand was steady. She was surprised to find it steady, but she was not going to waste time being surprised. He shifted slightly, assessing the angle to the alley. Don't, she said. He stopped. She moved 2 steps left and, without looking away from him, pushed the iron door closed. The padlock housing was within reach of her left hand. She engaged it with a sharp click, the padlock closing the door locked from outside, and dropped the key into her left coat pocket. You've locked us both out, he said. I've locked you in reach of the people inside who are going to hear me shout in approximately 10 seconds if you move. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Set down whatever you're carrying. He was carrying a leather satchel. He knew and she knew that it contained the portable record of his operation, the thing he always ran with first. He set it down. That door, he said, nodding at the locked iron door, was the only way this ends cleanly for either of us. You understand that? I understand that it ends cleanly for me and badly for you regardless of the door. I'm the one holding the gun. You won't shoot me. No, she agreed. I won't. I'm going to shout now instead. She did not shout. She did not need to. The back of the warehouse faced a street that ran alongside the river, and the sound of the locked door and the conversation had already drawn attention. A man in a leather apron from the cooperage 2 doors down was standing in the alley mouth, and behind him another figure. And from the front of the building, she could hear voices multiplying with the speed of a small town discovering something worth watching. Holloway looked at the growing audience with the expression of a man who had spent 30 years staying ahead of this moment and had now for the first time simply run out of ahead. The front door of the warehouse opened. Ethan came through it with 2 men Margaret didn't recognize, territorial marshals' badges on their coats, the detail that Ethan had arranged before they'd left Double C, and that he had not told her about until this morning because he had known she would object to the implication that she was being protected rather than participating. She had not objected. She had simply noted it for later discussion. Ethan looked at her, at the locked door, at Holloway standing with his hands carefully visible and a satchel at his feet. Something moved in his face. One of the things she had learned to read, a specific quality in the pale eyes that she did not yet have a name for but that felt at its edges like relief. He looked at Holloway. Holloway looked at him with the particular regard of a man who has been thinking about someone for a long time. "Ethan," he said. The smoothness had gone out of his voice. Not regret exactly, but something that wanted to sound like regret and didn't quite make it. "You should know without you I had nowhere to start. You opened the door for me. The introduction at Cheyenne. The agricultural fair." A pause precisely waited. "You know that." The alley was quiet. The marshal's men had stopped. Everyone was listening. Margaret watched Ethan's face. She had expected the words to land like a blow, the particular cruelty of them, the deliberate aim. They landed. She watched them land. But Ethan did not respond. He looked at Holloway with the steady, pale regard of a man who has said this to himself every night for 3 years and has arrived at the other side of it. He did not need Holloway's confirmation. He did not need Holloway to name his guilt in order for it to be real. And he did not need to argue with it because the guilt was not the thing that mattered most in this alley. What mattered most in this alley was a woman standing 4 feet from a locked door with a steady hand and a revolver she hadn't needed to fire. He looked at her instead of answering Holloway. She held his gaze for one moment. Then the marshals moved forward and it was over. The trial was held in Cheyenne in the 3rd week of November, in a courtroom with tall windows that let in the cold winter light in long, pale slabs across the wooden floor. Margaret sat in the 2nd row for most of it. She had submitted a written account of the financial fraud at Double C. In the documents she had compiled invoices, contract entries, reconciled accounts were entered as evidence. Victor Crane had been arrested in Laramie the week before on the basis of those documents. Aldous Webb had been found in Colorado after 3 weeks on the run, his travel funded by an emergency payment from an account the marshals had located in Denver. Chester Briggs had negotiated a reduced charge in exchange for his testimony. Margaret found she had no particular feelings about that. He had been a hired man doing what he was paid to do, the same economy that governed most things corrupt or otherwise. On the 3rd day of trial, the prosecuting attorney read 6 letters into evidence, letters from women who could not attend or who had attended in previous proceedings and chosen not to revisit it, or who had never come forward publicly and were choosing this occasion to do so from a distance and behind the shield of the record. Women from Georgia and California and Missouri and Ohio. Women who had saved and planned and hoped with a precision that made Margaret's chest ache, who had described their savings and their futures and their longing in letters to a man who filed them away as operational intelligence. The letters were read in the flat voice that legal procedure required, and the flatness made them more terrible, not less the specific hope in each one, more visible without the cover of emotion. Lily testified on the 4th day. She sat in the witness chair with her copper hair pinned back and her green eyes level, and she spoke in the even voice of someone who had rehearsed not the words, but the composure required to say them. She described her mother Sarah, the letters, the journey, the arrival at an empty station, the months of recovery that became something that couldn't be recovered from. She described the pneumonia in the flat declarative language of a 17-year-old who had chosen at some point to know the truth rather than the comfortable version. "She didn't die of pneumonia," Lily said. "She stopped wanting to be alive and then she wasn't. That's what happened." The courtroom was very quiet. Ethan testified on the 5th day. He had not been subpoenaed. He had requested to speak. He described the 1878 agricultural fair, his introduction of Grant D. Holloway to the Wyoming ranching community, the letter of recommendation he had written in advance on double C letterhead that had helped establish Holloway's legitimacy. He spoke precisely without self-exoneration, without the qualifying language that might have softened the account. The prosecuting attorney had tried to tell him the testimony wasn't necessary. Ethan had been clear that it was necessary to him. Margaret sat in the second row and watched him speak, and thought about the program in the locked drawer, the one he had kept as punishment rather than memory, and about what it meant that he was choosing to say this in a public record under oath so that it could not be taken back or revised or softened later. He was doing what she had told him the program was not doing. He was remembering it, not punishing himself with it, naming it clearly in front of witnesses and then letting the record hold it so he didn't have to hold it alone anymore. Grant Holloway received a sentence of 25 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. The Denver bank account located through Webb's cooperation containing the accumulated deposits of a decade of methodical theft held $48,000. After legal proceedings and recovery costs, each identified victim received a proportional restitution payment. Margaret received $3,800. Exactly. She sat with the bank draft in her hand for a long time in the hallway outside the courtroom, while the noise of the proceedings dispersed around her. She looked at the number on the paper. $3,800, written in the careful handwriting of a bank official who had no knowledge of what those numbers represented. 4 years of Saturdays, of mended dresses, of coal-rationed winters, of a life lived smaller than it needed to be in service of a future that had been stolen before it arrived. She folded the draft and put it in her coat pocket beside the contract from Double C, which she had carried since Red Hollow Station and had not yet decided where to keep permanently. Lily sat down beside her. "What are you going to do?" Lily asked. Margaret looked at the courthouse ceiling. "I don't know yet. I'm going to school," Lily said. "In Cheyenne, there's a girls' school." A pause. "Miss Calloway paid for it." Margaret looked at her. "Miss Calloway that's sitting right next to you." "I know." Lily's eyes were straight ahead. "I meant she already paid for it before the restitution came. She told me 2 weeks ago." A beat. "I wanted you to know I know." Margaret looked at the far wall of the courthouse corridor for a moment. The draft in her pocket was enough to cover the school fees and still leave most of what she'd lost intact. She had made the arrangement before the trial because the outcome of the trial was not something she intended to wait on before deciding what to do with the money Ethan had advanced her. She had been waiting on a bench for 3 days once. She was not accustomed to waiting on benches anymore. "You'll write to me," Margaret said. "Every Sunday." Lily paused. "The school has a writing instruction class on Tuesdays. I'm going to be very good at it." "I know." They sat in the corridor together while the winter light moved across the floor in slow degrees, and neither of them had anything more to say, which was the particular comfort of two people who have understood each other well enough to not require it. They rode back to Double C in the first week of December through a landscape that had finally committed to winter. The snow had come while they were in Cheyenne, 4 inches on the flat, more on the ridges, and it had settled into the permanence of a Wyoming winter, the kind that did not apologize or reverse itself, but simply established the new terms and waited for you to adapt. The mountains to the west were white to the tree line, then dark timber, then white again at the peaks. The sky was the particular blue of cold that has stopped being threatening because it has simply become the world. Margaret found she did not mind it. She had minded it in October at Red Hollow Station, had felt it as a pressure. An adversary, the cold as something working against her. Now it felt simply like the season. Like a fact that required appropriate clothing and preparation, nothing more and nothing less. Ethan rode beside her without talking much, which was his way when there was nothing that needed to be said. She had learned his silences well enough to move through them without filling them, to recognize the difference between the silence of withholding and the silence of ease. This was the silence of ease. She recognized it partly because it was in her too. They arrived at Double C in the late afternoon, the winter light already going gold and low. Frank was at the gate, not waiting exactly, but present in the way that men who don't admit to waiting are present when they are waiting. He looked at them both with that careful, revised expression that had become his normal register with her over the past weeks. "Trial went well," he said, "not a question." 25 years, Ethan said. Frank nodded once. He looked at Margaret. Something passed across his face, something that in another man in different circumstances might have been called pride. "Books are a mess again," he said. "I may have entered a feed delivery twice." "I'll look at it tomorrow," she said. He turned and went back toward the barn, and she heard very faintly the particular sound of a man who is not going to admit to being relieved but is. It was December, 2 weeks after the trial. 1 week after the snow had come down from the ridges and made the Double C yard a white-bordered world when they sat on the porch together in the evening. Not by arrangement. She had come out for air and found him there, a cup of coffee in his hand that had gone cold by the look of it, watching the mountains go dark in the last light. She had gone back inside for her own cup and come back out, and they had sat. The cold was sharp and clear. The kind of cold that doesn't feel violent, just permanent, just the world at its actual temperature when the pretense of warmth is removed. They sat with their cold coffee and the enormous quiet of a Wyoming winter evening and said nothing for a long while. "How long will you stay?" he asked. She looked at the mountains. The last color was leaving the peaks gold to rose to gray, the reliable sequence of a winter sunset that she had watched from this porch enough times now to know by heart. "I don't know," she said. "Your books aren't finished." He was quiet for a moment. "The books are finished. You finished them 3 weeks ago." She looked at her coffee cup. "Then I'll find something else that needs doing." "There's always something that needs doing." "I know." She paused. "That's why I said it." The mountains had gone fully gray. Now the last light up on the highest peaks hanging on with the particular stubbornness of things that don't let go easily. She watched them until the light was gone and the mountains were simply dark shapes against a sky that was beginning to fill with stars. "I'll keep making the books messy," he said, "if that helps." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains too, or at the place where the mountains had been in the dark. His expression had that particular quality she had been learning for weeks, the expression of a man who has said what he means and is not going to say more than that, who is leaving the rest in the air between them, where it can be taken or not taken, approached, or let alone. She looked at the stars coming out above the ridge. More every minute, the sky assembling itself into its winter configuration, the stars of a clear, cold night that would be harder and more abundant than anything she had seen from a Philadelphia window. "Then I'll stay long enough to fix them," she said. He turned to look at her then. She did not turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on the sky, on the stars, on the mountains that were there, whether you could see them or not. But she heard him, the quiet exhale, barely audible, the sound of something that had been held a long time being set down. Not everything, not all at once, just the beginning of it. They sat in the cold together, in the gathering dark, and the stars came out one by one, and neither of them had anything more to say, which was the first real peace either of them had found in a very long time. Epilogue. 6 months later. Spring came to Double C, the way spring always came to Wyoming. Not gradually but decisively, the snow line retreating up the mountains in visible stages, the brown grass of the valley showing green at the roots, while the ridges were still white. The creek running along the south pasture ran high and clear with snowmelt, and the horses in the lower pasture moved with the particular energy of animals reacquainting themselves with warmth. Margaret's office had changed. Not dramatically, the same long table, the same shelves, the same window facing the mountains. But there was a second set of keys on the hook by the door, now ranch branded, and the desk had a contract framed above it in simple pine, a partnership agreement drawn up in her own hand in legal language clear enough to satisfy any territorial court, signed by both parties on the 15th of January. She was co-owner of the Double C. The terms were ones she had written herself. She had a letter from Lily on the desk arrived that morning from Cheyenne. The handwriting was neat and precise. The Tuesday instruction class had been good for her, and the contents were extensive, a detailed account of a debate competition. She had won 3 pages about a book she was reading, a postscript about a girl in her dormitory who reminded her of Margaret, and whom she had therefore immediately befriended. The blank journal Margaret had given her on the day she left for Cheyenne was, the letter said, nearly full. "I'll need another one soon," Lily wrote. "I've been trying to write down things I want to remember, not just what happened. I think you showed me that." Margaret read the letter twice. Then she put it in the drawer where she kept the important things, the contract, Thomas's photograph, her grandmother's pen. Outside, she could hear Ethan in the yard, his voice. Frank's answering rumble, the sound of the spring work beginning in earnest. Victor Crane's civil trial had concluded in March. He had lost his Wyoming livestock license and faced a substantial judgment. Aldous Webb had pleaded to a reduced charge in February and would not practice as a contract clerk again. Chester Briggs was 3 territories away, and as far as anyone knew, keeping his head down. She went outside. Ethan was at the corral fence talking to Frank about the spring pasture rotation, the practical, pressing conversation of a working ranch in the first week of planting weather. He looked up when she came out, the pale eyes moving to her with the easy, specific attention he had given her since December. "There's a fence line down on the East Ridge," Frank said without looking at her. "I told him it was fine. He thinks it's not fine." "It's not fine," Ethan said. "Take me up to look at it tomorrow," Margaret said. Frank made a sound that was not quite disagreement and not quite agreement, and turned back to the horse he was grooming. Ethan's expression had that particular quality she recognized now, the one she had finally named in the long months since Casper. Not relief, something quieter and more permanent than relief. She understood it because she felt it too. They walked together out to the south pasture to check the creek level the way they had started doing every morning when the thaw began, a practical thing, a necessary thing, a thing that had become also simply the rhythm of a day. The mountains to the west were still half white, the higher peaks holding their snow into June as they always did, patient and enormous, and unchanged by anything that happened at their feet. They stood at the creek bank together and watched the water run. He had gone to Anna's grave 3 weeks ago. He had not said he was going, had simply come back from a 2-day ride with the expression of someone who had done a necessary thing. He had put something down at the marker. She had not asked what. She had known without asking that it was the program from the 1878 agricultural fair, the one from the locked drawer, the one he had carried as punishment. She had stood one step behind him at the graveside. She had not said anything. She had simply been there, a presence, a witness, a person who knew the whole weight of what the grave held and was not asking him to carry it alone or to set it down before he was ready. He had stood there a long time, and then he had turned and looked at her, and the expression in his face was not grief or relief or absolution, but something older and quieter than all of those things, the expression of a man who has said what he needed to say to someone who is no longer there and has been answered not by voice, but by the fact of endurance, the simple fact that the world continues. They had ridden home in the early evening without speaking, and the silence had been the fullest silence she had known since Thomas. Now at the creek bank, in the spring morning, the water running clear over stones, the mountains white and enormous above them, he turned to her with a question in his face that was not about the fence line. She looked at the mountains. She let the morning hold whatever it was going to hold. "The East Ridge fence," she said. "I want to see it." "I know," he said. They stood in the spring light beside the running water, and Margaret Calloway felt a particular quiet weight of a life that was being built again. Not the same life, not the life she had lost or the life she had planned, but something that was hers and real and steady, built from honest materials on honest ground. She had arrived at Red Hollow Station with the 11 cents and a list of broken promises. She had ended up here co-owner of a working ranch keeper of honest accounts, a woman who had locked a door herself and watched the law take what was behind it. Thomas would have appreciated the symmetry, she thought. He had believed the world was basically fair. She was less certain of that than he had been, but she was willing in this particular morning, in this particular valley, to keep building toward it anyway. That seemed like enough.